Hello, Neil from Diagonal Move here, taking a look today at Cataclysm, a Second World War, a strategic level World War II game from GMT Games. It's been around a little while now, 5-6 years, but I saw recently that it's also on the P500 reprint list over at GMT, so I thought I would get the game out and do a playthrough. Now this playthrough is going to be both a labour of love because this is one of my personal favourite war-themed games. It's also going to be arguably the most challenging playthrough I've done to date on the channel because this game is complex. It's not super well suited for solo, although you can do it as I'm about to show you. And there's just a lot going on to the point where if I tried to explain everything that was going on in the game from the scratch, right from the very first video, we would have a series of videos that runs on forever and lasts hours and hours and hours. So this first video is going to be quite short, just overviewing the game very simply and some of the concepts in the game. And then the next video, I'll just jump straight into the first turn and go from there. So why do I enjoy this game? Well, the reason is it's a full retelling of the Second World War. It has economics in it, politics, and then all the combat that you would expect from the Second World War theme. It covers the whole of the European theatre and Russia, and also the whole of the Pacific theatre. It covers naval island hopping. It covers the North Africa. You know, it's got Lend-Lease in it. There is representations of various different events in the Second World War. The Washington Naval Treaties in there. All sorts of stuff is in here, and that lends to its complexity. But what I really like about this game is very much in that title. It says a Second World War, not the Second World War. And so all the events that you will find in here and all the chits you'll pull out of the cup, they're all things that are, historical, but they don't necessarily have to happen, and they don't have to happen in the same order they did historically. For example, the war might not break out until 1941. The Italians may invade France. The Soviets and the Germans may never get into conflict at all if you wanted to do that. And it's entirely up to you as the players to create this scenario where the world ends up in conflict. And it just gives it a little something over those games that are more strictly historical and simulation style games, and I just think it's great. I really do. But as I said, it is quite complex. We have a 40-odd page rulebook, multiple factions, all with their own special rules, things like that. Certain things happen at certain times, and all sorts. So let's just have a look at the basic systems in the game, and hopefully then when you go on to watch the playthrough, you'll sort of get some idea of what's going on, essentially, without needing to read the rules yourselves. So basically, we have in the full game, and this is the full Cataclysm campaign, the war starts in 1933, or the game starts in 1933. Essentially, there's a period of political manoeuvring before the mobilisation and eventual conflict starts. The political side of things is represented by this display. If I can just get around my camera, this display here. And that display tells you the effectiveness of the governments in the period. And we have 7 separate governments we're looking at, 7 separate factions or powers as they're known in the game. There's the US, the UK and France for the democratic ideology, the Soviet Union obviously for the communists, and then Germany, Italy, and for the game purposes Japan as the fascist ideology. Now those ideologies are distinct. The Factions within them, however, do not need to ally. So forming an alliance between the UK and the US, for example, is something you have to do, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's very flexible like that. Germany and Japan don't have to come into an alliance, and all that kind of thing. Obviously, there are benefits to doing that within the game, but the politics of the game is represented by this track here, whether the powers are allied, as I mentioned, how effective they are at making political decisions. I'll get more into what some of the things are in a moment. The military side of things and the economics of the military are represented by these cards, which are faction specific, and they have a commitment level to that wartime economy. So everyone starts off as civilian, with the exception of the Japanese. Then you can move through rearmament, mobilization, total war, and eventually exhaustion. And as the game progresses and you move the factions through that rearmament, mobilization, total war layer of commitment, the number of units you have available and the armies and navies that you have grow in number, but there's a negative effect then on your political side of things. You become less stable as a government because you're spending all your money on the military. The military itself and the actions you can do with the military are represented obviously by the counters on the board, and they're quite abstract. There are army units, for example, the German army here. You can have an army that's a land army, and you have sort of a tank army on the other side, and you have to upgrade those through various actions that you can do. And that's true also for the Air Force, which can be upgraded to from a tactical air force to a strategic air force, which can do strategic bombing, and then you can have naval fleets and carrier fleets and submarines and so on. And they will fight when you choose to, and there are restrictions on when you can do that, depending on how whether you declare war and so on, which are political actions. It's all intertwined, like a great big mesh. But when you do fight, and as with many things in the game, you will roll dice, and the dice that you roll is based on your political effectiveness for political actions and for how you position certain things. There are certain military actions you can do that give you more or less dice and factors that you roll in. But essentially what it is, there's a dice system in the game where you roll a certain number of dice, and then you take the highest one, a 5 or 6 generally after modifiers, is successful. Anything under that is not successful, and that kind of reasonably true across the whole game. It's relatively simple, that part of it. So what do you do? I mean, well, you're going to have this stack of counters just here, and each turn they're going to go into a chip pull cup, and you'll pull a counter out of the cup each turn and resolve it. Now, the counters can be these counters I've got on the board here. They can be the navies, the armies, and all the rest of it. They can be political counters, where you, for example, the home front counter, where you are forced to undertake a home front test, which is a test of your political stability. And you may also have things like a crisis event. So these are essentially the timer in the game. When you pull one of these out, you have to roll against the table. Which table you roll against depends upon the status of the board and whether you're at war or not at war. And they have certain things happen around the board, which can impact how well you are scoring points, how well you control certain areas. You'll pull counters out of the cup until you've basically pulled out all the crisis markers, and then you'll see how many faction counters you've got left to play, and if there's a certain number, depending on the mobilization level, you will then end the turn. But it's not that straightforward, because you can add into the cup certain things during the course of a single turn. So for example, when you do an action, you may or you may not provoke politically another side. So, for example, if the Germans, for example, were to try and diplomatically take Denmark, to control Denmark through a non-military means, that would be a provocation against the UK. So the UK would be able to add one of their flags into the cup. Now the flags represent political actions, and these actions are spent in order to do certain things, so diplomacy, form an alliance, and so on and so forth. Everything that's listed here is a political action. The other form of action you can take, and again this is something you can do when you're not at war, is you can spend these tokens, which will be the offensives, and they represent military actions. What you can do with them is somewhat limited when you're not at war, but you can spend them. And again, certain things that you do will impact other players or other factions in turn. In addition to all this stuff that's going on, you can also, or you will also, have to deal with the outbreak of civil war. At the start of the game, the Chinese civil war is raging, and that will impact what you choose to do with some of those military actions. You can send support to one side or the other in the Chinese civil war, and that is going to have an impact on whether or not you control the region. But not just China. Some of those crisis events do include civil war breaking out in other places. So, for example, Spain is probably the most well-known example. But you could also have civil war breaking out in Eastern Europe. And when that happens, you could potentially lose control of an area, which will then impact your victory points. So, for example, if Romania here was to break out in civil war, and for some reason the French lost control, they would lose a VP. These cubes represent control of areas, and they are what is going to give you the victory points at the end of the game. The victor, or the winning ideology, is usually what wins. It's essentially a team game when you play it with 5 players, or each person has to control multiple factions if you're playing with less than that. The side or the ideology with the most VP wins at the end of the game. The end of the game is triggered by a move to total war, which is or global war, where essentially the world is at war. The Second World War is fully in effect, and then you've got a couple of turns after that happens, which can potentially go right the way through to 1949, depending on how late that event happens. The way to win the game is through those victory points, but you can end the game early if you force collapse of a power and then eventual surrender of that power. And if one ideology causes 2 powers to collapse and then surrender, they will trigger the end of the game also. There's a lot going on in the game. One of the things that really makes the game shine at a multiplayer level but is tricky to implement solo is this system of interrupts. So the turn order is you take a chit out of the cup, you play that chit, but the A faction can keep one of its chits in reserve on this track here for use when it chooses to, and it chooses to use those chits by interrupting the pull from the chit cup. So, for example, we might pull from the cup. It could be a crisis. We'll resolve the crisis. That's changed the board state, and then Germany might say, okay, I'm going to interrupt the flow and I'm going to play my code token from reserve. The Soviets could then say, okay, you've done that, I'm going to do the same with my chit that's in reserve, and so on. And you can have quite a elongated turn sequence before you actually draw the next counter from the cup officially. And then there are other things as well. For example, when you provoke other countries, you place political actions into the cup and things like that. And it the turn becomes very variable in its length as a result of that. there's a lot going on, but hopefully this video has given you a sense of what's involved and what you're going to do. There's politics, which is impacted by economics, which impacted by the military might, and ultimately all of the tension that's going to be simmering the first few turns is eventually going to erupt into conflict and military action. The more of that happens, the less stable the government is, the more you're going to be spending your economy on the war, and eventually the game will come to its natural conclusion. Factions themselves are quite asymmetric in some ways. They each have their own special rules. For example, the French are relatively weak compared to the US, who are very, very strong, but the French can do things a bit more quickly than the US, because the US are tied in with their resources. It takes a while to get them mobilized. The Soviets have their own challenges. They are the only faction in their ideology. They never ally with anybody. They are very much on their own, but they have a lot of resources. They have a vast territory that covers both maps, and some of that territory just cannot be conquered by anybody else because it's just impractical for, say, Japan to get all the way through to Moscow, for example. And so there are things in the game that prevent things getting too ahistorical. But the Soviets also have this system of what are they doing politically in their own country. So, for example, we start off with military reform, then you have political purges, and each of these postures, as they're known, impacts what the Soviets can do with the resources they have, and so on. Germany and Italy can ally, and Germany particularly are quite strong, but as you could imagine, they have their own challenges as they go through, and Japan start more able to commit their economy to war at the beginning, but obviously that puts them that bit closer to the exhaustion state, which is where things start to get really difficult in terms of winning the game if you go to exhaustion too quickly. Okay, anything else to think of before I end the video? Just a few things about the map. The areas are coloured according to the factions. So, for example, brown is the UK. Here, the fact that it says London shows that it's its home area because it's a certain font, and I mean, I don't be able to see this, but essentially the home areas are blue with a certain style font for France, brown with a certain style font for the UK, red for the Soviets, purple for Japan, green for the US, and so on. Areas that are not their home country, so for example in the French case, North Africa and Indochina on the other map, they are colonies because they're their own colour's country, their own country's colour rather. However, they are colonies. They are an extension of their home area essentially, with effects on the political and economic tracks when people invade them, whereas areas with cubes are just areas that are controlled politically or militarily by the faction whose colour cube it represents. We have these kind of neutral colours. These are the minor armies. There are resources on the board that we can pull in to build our stuff when we start building our armies and so on. But as you can imagine, I've got to talk now for the best part of 20 minutes, and I've not even scratched the surface of this game. I've literally just touched the very edge of one part of the game, really. So okay, this is, as I said, introductory video. I'll stop there because I'll just end up getting myself confused as well as yourselves. So the video that will follow will be the first turn. I'll see how it goes in terms of how long the series lasts. Some turns can be shorter than others, as I said, with their variable turn length. Okie dokie, that is the end of the video then, and I'll jump straight into Cataclysm, the Second World War, turn 1 next time. See you then.